The pincers have been in the coals since before dawn, and the woman on the ground can smell them before she can see them. Hot iron, a stink like a blacksmith's forge crossed with something else, something that will be her own hand in a moment. It is the 7th of January, 1611, in a market town in the Hungarian uplands. The ground is frozen hard enough to wring under boots, and she is kneeling on it because they have decided she will die today for the crimes of Countess Elizabeth Báthory. She did not commit them. She is not sure the Countess committed them either. What she is sure of, the only thing she is sure of, kneeling here with the crowd's breath fogging the cold air, is that the words that damned her mistress came out of her own mouth, and that they were not true when she said them, and that no one is going to ask her that now. She had said them 3 days ago, in a room she cannot unsee. There had been a notary with a quill. There had been men who knew exactly how much a body could take before it would agree to anything. They asked her how many girls the Countess had killed, and when she said she did not know, they showed her that, "I don't know," was not an answer they would accept. So she gave them a number. She does not even remember which number. It kept changing depending on what stopped the pain. They wrote it down, and a written number, she is learning, is a kind of immortality. It will outlive her by 400 years. A man takes her hand and forces the fingers flat. She hears the Countess's name read aloud again. The charge, the horror, the monster of the castle on the hill. And she wants to laugh, because the Countess is not here. The richest widow in the whole kingdom of Hungary is not kneeling on this frozen ground. The Countess is at home, in her castle, uncondemned, because women like her do not burn. Women like her, Ilona, burn. Women with no land, and no name that matters, and nothing to seize. That is the part the crowd does not understand. They think they are watching justice reach the people close to a killer. They are watching the state destroy the only witnesses who could ever take it back. Torn-out fingers do not sign a retraction. Ash does not stand up in a courtroom and say they made me say it. The pincers come out of the coals glowing white at the tip. She thinks of the other one, Dorothea, already screaming somewhere to her left. She thinks of the stakes driven into the ground and the green wood stacked around them, green so it burns slow. She thinks, absurdly, in the last clear moment she will have, that somewhere a book is supposed to exist with 650 names in it, a book everyone has heard about and no one has read, a book that is the entire reason for all of this, and that she has never once in her life laid eyes on it. The executioner lifts the torch. He lowers it toward the wood, toward the place where the flame will catch and climb. And in the last inch before the fire takes, to understand how a countess ends up condemned by a fire she was not even allowed to attend, how the most infamous female murderer in the history of the world was burned in effigy through the bodies of her servants, and never once made to stand and answer the charge herself. We have to go back, not to the killings, to the money, to a January morning 7 years before this one, when a soldier died in his bed and left the wealthiest woman in Hungary alone at the top of an empire of land, with a crown that owed her a fortune and a circle of powerful men who had every reason to want her gone. This is not the story you have been told about the Blood Countess. This is the case file underneath it, and it is a very specific kind of file, the kind where the crime everyone knows was written down for the first time more than a century after the accused was already dead. By the end of this, you will know exactly which parts of the most famous horror story in Europe are real, which parts were invented, and this is the part that turns the whole thing over, why the one procedure that could have separated the two was the one thing her accusers made absolutely certain would never happen. This is Cursed Queens, where we take the women history called monsters and read the evidence back, the real record, under the cartoon. If that is the history you came here for, subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, because the end is where this case stops being about a murderer and starts being about her money. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Let me tell you the version you already half know, and I am going to tell it well, because it is a magnificent piece of horror, and because you cannot understand how completely it has been dismantled until you feel how solid it seems. Elizabeth Báthory, born in 1560 into one of the oldest and most powerful noble houses in Central Europe, a family that at its height controlled Transylvania outright and put one of its own on the throne of Poland. In 1575, she marries a warlord, Ferenc Nadasdy, a man who will earn from the Ottomans the name the Black Knight of Hungary. And here I need you to hold on to a detail the horror story always skips, because it is going to matter more than any needle or any candle. Ferenc spends years at a time away at the front, commanding Hungarian forces against the Turks, and those wars are expensive. They are paid for, in part, by the family's own money, lent up the chain to the crown itself. Year after year, the King of Hungary runs up a debt to her husband's house. Remember that loan. The king owes this family a fortune. Nobody in the legend ever mentions it, and by the end of this, you will understand why. For now, back to the story as it is told. While her husband is away at his wars, Elizabeth runs their vast estates from a hilltop fortress called Countess, a woman of enormous power in her own right, mistress of one of the largest private landholdings in the kingdom. And then, the story goes, she begins to kill. At first it is servant girls, peasant daughters, sent up to the castle to work, who go in through the gate and are never seen again. The methods, as the legend tells them, are almost unbelievable in their cruelty. Girls beaten until they cannot stand, needles driven under fingernails, skin burned with candles and heated iron, girls stripped and thrown into the winter courtyard and doused with water until they froze into statues overnight. The countryside starts to whisper. Mothers stop sending their daughters up the hill. So, the legend says, she changes her prey. She starts taking in the daughters of the lower nobility, girls sent to her to learn manners and courtly graces, and those girls begin to vanish too. And now the whispers reach people who matter. Now there are noble families asking where their daughters went, and over all of it hangs the single image that made her immortal. The reason her name outlived every other killer of her century. They say she discovered, when a servant girl's blood splashed across her skin, that young blood kept her young, and so, the story goes, she began to bathe in it, to drain virgin girls and lie in their blood, to hold back her own aging. The Blood Countess. That is the phrase, that is the picture in your head right now, and it got there for a reason. By the time it ends, the numbers are apocalyptic. The Guinness Book of Records lists her, to this day, as the most prolific female murderer in history. 650 victims. And the source for that number, in the legend, is the most chilling detail of all, a book, a private register, kept in the Countess's own hand, in which she is said to have recorded the name of every single girl she killed. 650 entries. The king himself, Matthias II, orders an investigation. He hands it to the most powerful man in the kingdom after the crown, the Palatine, György Thurzó, effectively the king's viceroy in Hungary. Thurzó gathers witnesses, hundreds of them, and then, on New Year's Eve of 1610, he rides up to the castle in the dark and storms it, and, the legend says, catches her in the act. A dead girl on the floor, another girl dying, the monster taken red-handed in her own lair. Her servants, the ones who helped her, are dragged to trial and burned alive. But the Countess herself? She is too high-born to hang. So instead, they wall her up. Brick by brick, they seal her into a single room of her own castle, leaving only a slot for food and a slit for air. And there, the story ends. She rots alive in the dark for 4 years, until a guard, peering through the slot one morning in 1614, finds her dead on the floor. A monster, caught in the act, sealed in stone by her own crimes. It is a perfect story. It has a villain, a signature, a body count, a book of the dead, and a poetic punishment. It has been retold for 400 years, put in the record books, wrapped around vampire movies and tourist castles. And I want you to notice 3 things about it before we go any further. Notice that the most famous detail, the bloodbath, is the one thing that would leave the most evidence and the least deniability, and hold that thought. Notice that the entire body count rests on a single book that, in every telling, someone found. Remember that this book was found. And notice, above all, the shape of the ending. She is punished, sealed away, finished. Punished implies convicted. Convicted implies tried. Remember that word, tried. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to take the floor out from under this entire story. Here is how a case is supposed to work. Someone dies. You establish that they died. You establish who was near them. You count. You cross-check the counts against each other and against physical fact, and against the people who had reason to lie. And the closer a claim sits to someone who actually saw the thing, the more it is worth. The further it travels through other mouths, the less. Nobody did that with Elizabeth Báthory, so we are going to do it now, 4 centuries late. And what we find is not one weak link in an otherwise sound chain. Every load-bearing part of this case rots, and it rots in a specific order, and the order tells you exactly what happened. There are 4 rooms where this case was made. I want to walk you into each one, and I want you to look at who is standing in them. The first room has a table, a quill, and a frightened villager. Autumn, 1610. 2 men are riding the muddy tracks between the villages under the hill. Royal notaries, Kerasturi and Siraki, sent out by the Palatine, with orders to collect sworn statements about the woman in the castle above. Picture the work: a cottage door, a peasant wiping her hands, sitting down opposite 2 officials from a world she has never been allowed into, being asked what she knows about the mistress of the district. She knows what everyone knows. She knows what her neighbor told her that her cousin heard. And a man in good boots writes it down as testimony. By that autumn, they had gathered around 52 statements. By the time the thing was finished, the count was over 300, one of the largest bodies of testimony in any case of the era. 300 witnesses. Now, here is the question no retelling ever asks. Of those 300-plus people, how many gave the number 650? 1. Not 100, not 50, not 10. One single witness, out of more than 300, is the origin of the number that made Elizabeth Báthory the most prolific murderer in the history of the female sex. And we will come back to who that one witness was, because she deserves her own room, and it detonates. E1. But first, look at what everybody else said, because if you strip out that one number and read the first-hand accounts, the people who actually worked in these castles, who were physically present, who could have walked you to a grave, the figures you get are these. A castellan at the hilltop castle spoke of around 7 girls dead at the manor. Castellans at the family's other great estate gave numbers like 175 and 2 to 300. The king's own letter, in January 1611, put it at more than 300. Look at that spread. 7, 175, 200, 300, 650. That is not a measurement. A real body count does not swing by a factor of 90 between witnesses. That is a rumor growing as it travels, and watch the direction it grows in. The lowest number, 7, comes from the man standing closest to the actual manor, the one who lived in the building and would have had to carry them out. The highest number, 650, comes from the person standing furthest from any first-hand knowledge at all. The number gets bigger in exact proportion to how far it is from someone who could actually have counted. And it is not proof of innocence. I want to be careful here. It is proof that the scale is fiction. Something bad may have happened in that household. But 650 did not happen. You cannot lose 650 girls from one district of a country whose entire population was under 2 million and have it register as a rumor. That is not a series of murders. That is a visible depopulation. That is empty villages, unworked fields, a demographic hole you could see from the next county. And there is no such hole. The number is impossible on its face. So walk into the second room and meet the woman it came from. She is sitting in front of the same notaries. She is a servant. Her name is Susanna. And here is the first strange thing about her. Of the more than 300 people who gave testimony in this case, she is the only one who is recorded without a surname. Everyone else in that pile of paper is a person you could, in principle, go and find. Everyone else has a village, a father, a household, a name you could chase. She is a first name and a number. She walks into the record, hands over the most consequential statistic in the history of murder, and walks out of it forever. And listen to what she actually says at that table. She does not say she saw 650 girls die. She does not say she counted bodies. She does not say she carried one. She says she has heard that there is a book, a private register, and that in this book are listed 650 names, and that a man named Jakub Silvasi, one of the Countess's own court officials, has seen it. Follow that chain slowly, because it is the spine of the entire legend, and it is made of nothing. Susanna did not see the book. Susanna heard that the court official saw the book. The most famous murder statistic in history is not an eyewitness account. It is not even a second-hand account. It is a third-hand account, a rumor about a book that someone else supposedly read. And now let me put you in the third chair in that room, because this is the part that should raise the hair on your arms. Jakub Silvasi, the man she names, the man who supposedly held this register of the dead in his own two hands, was right there in the same investigation. He came in, he sat down, he gave his own sworn statement to the same officials with the same quill scratching away. And he never mentions the book. Not once. He does not describe it. He does not say where it was kept, or what was in it, or what it felt like to turn the pages of a ledger of murdered girls. He does not say it exists. The one man alive who could have confirmed the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case sat in front of the investigation that needed it, and said nothing about it at all. The book was never produced. No judge ever saw it. It was never entered into evidence, never quoted, never counted, never touched. It exists in exactly one place in the entire historical record, in the mouth of one surnameless woman, reporting what she heard about what another man supposedly saw. A man who, given the chance to back her up, stayed silent. And even the scribe knew it. When the clerk wrote Susanna's claim down, he flagged it, noted, in the margin, that this was known only from hearsay. Think about that hand, moving across the page. The man holding the pen, in the moment of writing, stamped the foundation stone of the whole legend as rumor. 400 years of horror rests on a line its own author didn't believe. The register of 650, the black book in the Countess's own hand, that every retelling treats as the smoking gun, is a phantom. It is a story about a book nobody produced. Let me say something to you directly here, because I suspect some of you already know this feeling in your body. There is a specific kind of injustice where the thing everyone knows about you turns out to be one person's rumor that hardened into fact because it got repeated enough. If you have ever watched a thing that was never true become the thing everyone is certain of, just because it was said confidently and often, you know exactly how a phantom book becomes 650 confirmed victims. Tell me below if you have lived some version of that. I read every comment, and this is the kind I read twice. Now back to it. So if the number is inflated and the book is a phantom, what is left? What was the case actually built on? The third room answers that, and the third room has a rack in it. Confessions. 4 of them. 4 of the Countess's servants, Ilona Yo, a nurse, Dorotia Sentes, called Dorko, a young man, Janos Ujvari, called Fichko, and a woman named Katarina Bytča. These four were arrested with the Countess, and these four confessed to helping her torture and kill. Their confessions are the evidentiary heart of everything. And here is how those confessions were obtained. On the rack, under torture, the four were interrogated with pain until they produced answers, and the answers they produced are where the horror specifics come from. The needles, the burnings, the numbers that kept shifting. This is not disputed. It is not a revisionist claim. The trial record itself is a record of tortured testimony. In the legal culture of the time, that was simply how you got a confession out of a commoner. You hurt them until they agreed. Now, a tortured confession is worth something only if the person can later stand by it freely. If, given safety, they say, yes, it was true, I said it because it was true, then it holds. If they recant the moment the pain stops, it was worthless. The entire value of a confession, extracted under torture, lives or dies on what the person says afterward, in the cold light, when they are no longer being hurt. So watch what the state did with these four. On the 2nd of January 1611, the four servants were tried in the town. 5 days later, on the 7th, the sentences were carried out, and they were not carried out slowly, or with any interest in preserving these people as witnesses. Ilona Hyo and Dorothea Sentes, the two women whose confessions did the most to damn the Countess, had the fingers torn from their hands with red-hot pincers, and were then burned alive. Immediately, the young manservant, spared the pincers for his youth, was beheaded, and his body thrown on the same fire. Only Bytča was kept alive, imprisoned, and notably, the testimony suggested she had been bullied and coerced by the others, which is to say the one servant who might have complicated the story is the one they didn't burn. Think about the timing. These are the prosecution's star witnesses. These four mouths are the entire case. And within days of giving the testimony that built that case, 3 of them are ash. The 2 who could most incriminate the Countess, and therefore the 2 who could most exonerate her, if they ever took it back, are destroyed with a speed and a savagery that makes no sense if your goal is justice, and perfect sense if your goal is silence. Dead mouths do not recant. Torn-out fingers do not sign a statement saying they made me say it. The state extracted the confessions under torture, and then, before the ink was dry, made certain the confessors could never, ever take them back. Go back to the woman we opened with, kneeling on that frozen ground with the pincers coming out of the coals, 5 days after she said a number she could not remember choosing. That was Ilona Hyo. Now you know what her screams actually bought. Not justice, a story that could never be cross-examined. Which brings us to the 4th room, and the 4th room is empty. Go back with me, for a moment, to the night it started. It is the last night of 1610. Snow on the hill at the castle, torches guttering against a black sky, breath fogging in the cold. Armed men climb toward the castle gate, and at their head rides the Palatine, György Thurzó, the most powerful man in the kingdom after the king. Inside, the richest widow in Hungary. There is no herald reading out a court's warrant, because no court has ruled on anything. There is no judge riding with them. There is only the Palatine and his men and a door. They take her out of her own house in the dark, and they take 4 of her servants with her, and the snow squeaks under the boots as they lead them down. A kitchen girl watching from a doorway would have no way of knowing that she is not watching justice arrive. She is watching a seizure, ordered by a king who is owed money, led by a man who will end up owning this castle. Now hold that image, because everything about what happens next only makes sense once you know what did not happen next. I have been telling you about a trial. That trial, in January 1611, where the servants were sentenced and burned, and your mind, this whole time, has been quietly filling in an assumption, the same assumption every retelling relies on. You have assumed that somewhere in all of this, the Countess herself was tried. She was not. Read that again and let it land. Because it is the fact the entire legend is built to hide. Elizabeth Báthory, the most prolific murderer in the record books, the woman in the Guinness Book, the blood countess of 1,000 retellings, was never tried. Not once. She was never put before a court. She was never made to answer the charge. She was never allowed to speak in her own defense. Never allowed to face a witness. Never allowed to see that phantom book that supposedly held 650 names. There was no trial of Elizabeth Báthory. There was no verdict. There was no sentence. She was never convicted of a single murder in her life. The 4 servants were tried so that there would appear to be a proceeding. The Countess was simply taken. On New Year's Eve of 1610, the Palatine came up the hill to the castle with armed men and seized her. No warrant of any court, because no court had ruled on anything. And from that night until the night she died, 3.5 years later, she was held, confined. And in all that time, and this is the detail I planted for you at the very start, so hold it now. In all that time, not once was she asked a single question by a court. 4 years of confinement, and not 1 hour in a courtroom. Not because there was nothing to ask, because a courtroom was the one place her accusers could not afford to let her stand. And that is a different kind of fact from the others. The number growing, the phantom book, the burned witnesses, those tell you the evidence was rotten. The empty courtroom tells you they knew it was rotten. You do not skip the trial of the richest, most infamous accused murderer in your kingdom because you are confident in your case. You skip it because you are terrified of it. You skip it because a trial is a place where a woman with her own lawyers, her own powerful relatives, and a genuine grievance could stand up and start asking her own questions. Questions like, where is the book? Questions like, who benefits when I am gone? There is a particular kind of helplessness that you feel in the body, the sensation of a verdict being reached about you, over your head, in a room you are locked out of, while you stand on the wrong side of the door, with no way to make them listen. If you have ever been judged and sentenced in someone's mind, a family's, a workplace's, a whole room's, before you ever got the chance to open your mouth and say your side, comment and tell me, I don't think you're going to be the only one. And that question, who benefits, is where we are going next. Because to understand why 4 separate load-bearing facts all rotted in the same direction, you have to stop asking whether she did it, and start asking a much older question. Who got the money? But before I take you there, I owe you the honest work, because there are other explanations for all of this, and some of them are held by serious people, and a case that only knocks down the weakest version of the other side is not a case at all. So let me line them up, from the one that collapses easiest to the one that comes closest to fitting, and take each one down on the record. The first theory is the simplest. She was exactly what they said, a sadistic serial killer, and the record is basically sound. This is seductive because parts of it are genuinely well supported. The servants confessed. 300 people testified. 2 castellans, independently, gave figures in the hundreds. And I am not going to stand here and tell you that household was gentle, because I do not believe it was. Put yourself in that kitchen for a moment. You are 14, you have been sent up the hill because your family needs the wages, and you have broken something, or been slow, or been unlucky. And the woman who owns the district, who owns the ground your mother's house stands on, who answers to no court that would ever hear you, is standing over you, and there is nobody in the world you can tell. That is not a legend. That is the ordinary physics of a great estate in 1609, and girls did die inside it. The abuse and death of servant girls in a noble household of that era is not just plausible, it is probably, at some scale, real. But she was cruel to servants, and the record of 650 is sound, are 2 completely different claims. And this theory smuggles the second in behind the first. The moment you test the record, really test it, it fails. The confessions were tortured out of people who were then killed before they could recant. The number balloons precisely as it leaves first-hand knowledge. The signature crime, the bloodbath, appears in no document of the investigation at all, and the accused was never tried. Every single mechanism that could have verified the killer version of the story was either coerced, destroyed, or deliberately skipped. Real cruelty survives this. Sound record of a 650-count serial killer does not. It isn't a sound record, it's a rumor with a body count attached. The second theory is gentler, and you will have heard it. She was mentally ill, epileptic, or mad. And this one has a real hook. The Báthory family genuinely did carry documented epilepsy and instability in the bloodline, so a medical explanation feels both compassionate and grounded. It lets us say she couldn't help it, instead of they made it up. But look at what it's actually doing. It is a retrospective diagnosis, made across 4 centuries, with no contemporary clinical evidence whatsoever. Nobody at the time described seizures or madness driving murders. And notice the sleight of hand. To diagnose her as a compulsive killer, you first have to accept that she was a compulsive killer. This theory doesn't test the crime count. It swallows it whole and then offers to feel sorry for her about it. It explains a monster we have not actually proven existed. You cannot medicalize a murder spree you cannot first demonstrate happened. The third theory is political in a different direction, that this was religion. Báthory was Protestant. The Habsburg crown was Catholic, in the thick of the Counter-Reformation, and the man who first wrote the blood legend down was a Jesuit. So the frame, this theory says, was confessional, Catholic power crushing a Protestant noble, and that is closer. There is a real strand of confessional tension in this story, but it breaks on one inconvenient man. Thursaw, the Palatine, the investigator, the person who actually engineered her downfall, was himself a Protestant, the same faith as his supposed victim. If this were a Catholic plot to destroy a Protestant countess, the chief architect would not have been her co-religionist. Religion is a thread running through the era, but it is not the engine of this case, because the people who actually moved against her did not divide along the lines it predicts. Something else lines them up. Follow their bank accounts, not their pews, and the pattern snaps into focus. Hold that. And the fourth theory is the one that comes closest to fitting, because it reaches for the most famous detail and tries to explain it directly. A blood disorder. Porphyria. The idea, which got enormous media traction in the 1980s, is that a genuine medical condition, a disorder of the blood, could explain an obsession with blood, could even be the seed of the vampire legends that cluster around her. It is elegant. It takes the single strangest fact about her, the bathing, and gives it a clinical root. And it fails on 2 separate, independent grounds, either one of which is fatal. The first is biochemistry. The theory doesn't even work on its own terms. Bathing in or ingesting blood does not treat porphyria. It doesn't deliver the thing the body is missing, and the specific severe form you would need is extraordinarily rare. But forget the biochemistry, because the second problem is the one that should stop you cold. And to see it, I want to take you into one more room, a room 115 years after everything you have watched so far. It is 1729. Elizabeth Báthory has been dead and buried for 115 years. Everyone who ever testified against her is dead. Thursaw is dead. Matthias is dead. Susanna, whoever she was, is dead. The villages have been rebuilt, the wars have moved on, and the whole business is a piece of local folklore in a corner of the Habsburg lands. And in a quiet study, a Jesuit priest named Laszlo Töröcsy sits down to write a book about the history of Hungary. He has the old papers about the Countess. He has the tortured confessions, and the peasant rumours, and the hearsay about the register. He has a good story that is missing one thing, an image, a reason for a reader to feel it in the spine. So he writes that she bathed in the blood of virgins to keep herself young. That is where it comes from. That is the entire provenance of the most famous detail in the history of female crime. Not a witness, Not a confession, not the charges. The bloodbath is not in the charges. It does not appear in one single document from her lifetime, not in the testimony of the 300, not in the interrogations of the 4 servants who were tortured until they said everything their questioners wanted, and then some. Under the rack, with their bodies being destroyed for answers, not one of them produced the bloodbath. That detail was never squeezed out of a screaming woman. It was composed, calmly, by a man at a desk, more than a century later, who was born long after the accused was already in the ground. Now go back to the porphyria theory and see what it is doing. It is a medical explanation for a symptom that did not exist until 115 years after the patient was buried. It is a real answer to a fake question. 4 theories: sadist, madwoman, religious martyr, medical curiosity. Every one of them makes the same mistake in a different costume. Every one assumes the crime and argues about the cause. But the crime, the industrial crime, the 650 crime, the bloodbath crime, is the thing that was never established. So let us stop asking what made her do it. Let us ask the only question the evidence actually supports. Who wanted her gone, and what did they get? Start with what she actually was, in ledger terms, because the legend never bothers to. Strip away the candles and the needles and the black book, and look at Elizabeth Báthory, the way the men around her looked at her, not as a monster, but as an asset. When her husband died, she did not simply become a widow, she became the single largest private landowner in the Kingdom of Hungary. Not wealthy in coins, wealthy in territory. Castles, villages, mills, vineyards, whole working districts. And in a kingdom torn in half by the Ottoman wars, land that still produced crops and rents was the rarest, most fought-over thing there was. All of it now sat under the control of one aging woman with no husband left to answer to. Now look at who was standing around her when the music stopped. She had sons-in-law who had married into the family and already counted her estates as half theirs, men waiting on an inheritance held up by one stubborn old life. She had a son, an heir. She had, circling above all of them, the king's own viceroy, a man with lands of his own beside hers, and dynastic ambitions for his own son. And she had, further up still, the crown itself, a king presiding over her case, who was not watching from a safe, disinterested distance at all. And you do not have to imagine what those men wanted, because you can watch what they took. Picture Countess in the spring after the arrest. The woman who owns it is upstairs, alive, in a guarded room, never charged with anything, and downstairs, her house is being inventoried. Men are walking her halls with lists. In the villages below, her fields are being walked off and measured and written into other men's ledgers. Her sons-in-law's portions, her son's portion, the estate of a living woman being carved up around her body while she listens to the footsteps through the floor. And in the middle of it, moving through the rooms with the confidence of a man at home, is Gheorghe Thurzor, the Palatine, the investigator, the one who rode up the hill on New Year's Eve to bring a monster to justice. He ends up owning the castle. The man who investigated the monster took her house and lived in it. That is not a coincidence you get to ignore. A widow sitting on more land than anyone else in the country, and a ring of powerful men, heirs, in-laws, a viceroy, a king, every single one of whom ended up better off with her removed than with her alive and in charge of what was hers. That is a motive with 5 faces. So when you have a victim that valuable, and a set of beneficiaries that powerful, and a case built on a number that grew, a book nobody saw, witnesses burned before they could recant, and a trial that was deliberately never held, you stop asking whether the accused was a good woman. You ask the oldest, coldest question there is, the one that solves more cases than any other. Follow the property. Who is holding it when the story ends? So follow it. Let me tell you what I have actually been walking you toward. It is not a diagnosis. It is not a disorder. And it is not, in the end, simply a debt, though a debt is where it begins. What I have been walking you toward is the anatomy of a frame, a monster with a motive, a paper trail, and a birth date. Take the motive first, because it is the smallest part of what I want to leave you with, the part that only explains the timing. In 1604, her husband died. The Black Knight of Hungary, the Ottoman war commander, dead in his bed in January of that year, and the moment he was gone, the woman who had run his estates became the wealthiest and most exposed person in the entire kingdom. No husband to shield her, no husband whose sword made her untouchable. Just a widow of around 44, sitting on the largest private landholding in Hungary, and one of the greatest names in Central Europe, a house that within living memory had put her own kinsman, her uncle Stephen, on the throne of Poland. A prize, in other words, and a crown that owed her house a fortune. Those long wars against the Turks had been paid for, in part, by loans from her family up the chain to the king himself. And King Matthias II, the man who ordered the investigation, personally owed an enormous sum to the very woman his Palatine was about to seize. Now watch what the arrest did to that debt. Convict her outright, and the crown swallows the whole estate, and the loan simply vanishes. Confine her quietly, and the land gets carved among the men already circling it. Her sons-in-law, her son, and the Palatine himself, Thurzo, who walked away owning the very castle he had locked her inside. And the king's debt? Somewhere in a chancery room, a clerk takes down the book where the crown keeps what the crown owes. He finds the line, the sum lent, year after year, out of the Nádasdy estates, to pay for the men who held the Turks off the king's own border. And he draws a line through it. That is all it takes. No blood, no candles, no needles. A man at a desk with a pen and an obligation of a lifetime simply stops existing because the woman it was owed to is now a monster in a locked room, and monsters are not creditors. Remember the first thing I told you about this case. They wrote it down, and a written thing outlives the person. It cut both ways. One stroke of ink made her the most murderous woman in history. Another stroke, in another book, made the king a free man. After her arrest, the debt was cancelled. And here is my one honest line, said once, because accuracy is the whole reason you are still here, that the money was the motive, that these men sat down and consciously built a monster to seize an estate and erase a loan, is the reading of historians, argued most forcefully by Laszlo Nagy, and it is an inference, not a signed confession. No document survives in which anyone admits the plot. What is flatly documented is narrower. The debt existed, the debt was cancelled, the Palatine profited, the land was divided. That is the why. And that is the only hedge you will hear from me for the rest of this video. Because the why is not the part that should keep you up tonight. The why is old news. Some version of "she was framed for her land" is the reading half the internet will hand you already. Here is the part almost no one ever actually says out loud. Set the motive aside completely. You do not have to believe a single word about a conspiracy for what comes next, because these three things need no theory at all. They are simply, forensically, true. Three of them. Say each one slowly. The 650 is a ghost. Say it. The number that put her in the record books. The number that makes her, on paper, the most murderous woman who has ever lived, came from one witness. One. Out of more than 300. The only one recorded with no surname. And she never saw a single body. She said she had heard of a book, in which the names were kept, that one of the Countess's own officials had supposedly read. That official testified too, and never once mentioned the book. No judge ever saw it. It was never produced, never counted, never touched by the court. The most famous murder statistic in human history is a rumor about a register that one nameless woman heard second-hand. That is not evidence. That is a ghost with a number painted on it. Now the second one. The bloodbath has a birthday. Sit with that sentence, because it is the strangest one in this entire case. The single most famous thing about this woman, that she bathed in the blood of virgins to hold back her age, appears in not one document from her lifetime. It was written down, for the very first time, in 1729, by a priest at a desk, 115 years after she was already dead and buried. The detail that defines her, the image the whole world carries, invented by a man who was born after she was gone. You are not remembering a crime, you are remembering a piece of fiction with a publication date. And now the last one. Say this one quietly, because it needs no volume at all. The woman in the Guinness Book of Records, the most prolific female murderer in history, was never tried. There was no court. There was no verdict. There was no sentence. In 3.5 years of confinement, she was never once brought before a judge, never once made to answer a charge, never permitted to see the ghost book or face a single witness against her. She was never convicted of one murder, not one. The most infamous killer of her sex, the monster in the record books, is a woman no court on earth ever found guilty of anything at all. That is what the money bought: a ghost, a fiction, and a silence, and 4 centuries of everyone agreeing not to check. And that is the part that should genuinely make you angry, angrier maybe than the blood ever did. So aim it, and aim it precisely. Aim it at Thurzo, who investigated a monster and moved into her castle, at a crown that owed her a fortune and found her guilty of being owed it. But save the largest share for the 400 years that came after, for every teller who took a dead priest's invention, a nameless woman's second-hand rumour, and a confession torn out of servants who were burned before they could take it back, and printed all of it, confidently, as history. They even improved the ending. Summer, 1614. 2 priests climb the hill to the castle, because the woman inside it is old now, and someone has decided she should not die without the last rites. And the room they are brought to is not a tomb. There is no slot for bread, no slit for air, no wall of fresh brick. There is a woman who gets up, who moves about her own castle, who is watched and guarded and silenced and going nowhere, but who is not, and never was, bricked alive into a hole in the dark. They saw her. They wrote it down. That famous image, the Countess sealed into a single room, rotting for 4 years, the poetic punishment that closes every retelling, comes from the Palatine's own account, from Thurzo, from the man who took her house. Even her punishment was a story polished after the fact, by the person with the most to gain from how it sounded. The men who profited are long dust. The lie is the thing that is still alive. Now stop reading it as history for a moment, and put your own body inside those walls. Your husband is dead, and every ounce of protection he gave you died in the bed beside him. It is the last night of the year, and you hear boots on frozen stone, and men you did not invite are in your house, and hands close on your arms in the dark, and take you, out of your own home, down the hill, without one word of a charge. And you wait to be asked. Surely you will be asked. Surely there is a room, a judge, a chance to stand up and say your side. Imagine the door locking, and the days going by, and no one coming. A week, a month, a season, a year. Your own walls around you, a guard at the door, and below you the sound of your servants dying, and your land being measured out to other people's sons. 3 years of your body held in the dark, while your name, somewhere out beyond those walls, is turned into a horror you will never once be allowed to answer. And then a cold night in August, and you tell someone your hands are cold, and by morning you are gone, never charged, never tried, never convicted of anything, and 400 years later, the whole world knows exactly one thing about you, and it was made up by a man who was born after you were dead. That is the woman under the legend. So let me ask you where you land, and I mean it as a real question, because this one genuinely splits people. Was Elizabeth Báthory a real killer whose true crimes were merely exaggerated? Was she wholly framed, an innocent woman destroyed for her money and her land? Or do you read it the third way, the way I lean but will not force on you, that there was real cruelty in that household, real dead girls, a genuinely brutal noblewoman, but that the legend, the 650, the blood, the monster, was manufactured on top of it by men who wanted what she had? Killer, framed, or a real cruelty wrapped in a fabricated myth? Where do you land, and why? Tell me below. I read every comment, and this is exactly the kind of argument I love having down there with you. Next, I'm opening the file on Anne Boleyn, the queen they called a witch. They said she seduced a king with sorcery and a sixth finger and a mark on her throat, and that her own body confessed her guilt. The truth is written in something her physicians could see and could not name, a pattern in what her body kept doing, over and over, that the men who killed her read as a curse. Everyone tells this story wrong. I won't. I'll see you in the next one. If this changed how you see her, if the Blood Countess looks different now than it did an hour ago, subscribe so the next case finds you. And tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country below. It never stops amazing me how far these stories travel. They were never cursed. They were never mad. They were never barren. They were women the record was afraid of. And the file is finally open.